Welcome back to the deep dive. I'm really glad you're here with us today because we are doing something, well, a little different than our usual format.
Yeah, definitely a pivot from the usual.
Right. Usually we're sitting here sifting through, white papers, digital data sets, clean, modern reports.
Very clean, very sterile.
Exactly. But today we are actually sifting through the dirt. We're getting down into the dust and the debris of the ancient Near East.
Bringing out the shovels.
We are. Because we want to answer a question that has really hung over Western academia and honestly over the faith of millions of people for about, 200 years?
Yeah, at least 200. It's basically the ultimate showdown, right? History versus folklore.
That is the perfect way to frame it. And to really set the stage for you, the listener, we have to kind of mentally travel back in time for a second.
Right, back to the 19th century.
Yeah, picture the faculty lounges of these prestigious European universities, like Tübingen in Germany.
Or Oxford.
Or Oxford, exactly. Late 1800s. Heavy oak furniture, guys smoking pipes, very serious men with very impressive beards.
A quintessential academic scene.
Right. And the Enlightenment is just in full swing. Darwin has just published on the origin of species. And there's this movement rising in these rooms called liberal scholarship.
Or higher criticism. That was the other term they used.
Higher criticism, yeah. And the prevailing mood in those rooms regarding the Bible was, well, let's call it polite skepticism.
If it was polite at all, frankly, a lot of times it was just outright dismissal.
Yeah.
The assumption, the baseline assumption, was that the Bible was essentially a collection of, and this is a quote, pious forgeries.
Pious forgeries. Yeah. Man, that is a loaded term. Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
It's a super heavy accusation. The idea was that the stories of, say, Abraham, Moses, David, Daniel, they weren't history. They were myths.
Like fairy tales.
Essentially, yeah. They viewed them as Jewish versions of King Arthur or, Greek legends like the Odyssey. These scholars argued that the texts were written hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years after the events they claimed to describe.
So they thought they were just made up later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Invented by priests during the Babylonian exile, or even later, just to give their religion some, ancient street cred.
So the argument was that figures like Moses or Abraham were fictional characters. Like they were created to explain the origins of the tribe. Kind of like Romulus and Remus for Rome.
Precisely. That was the consensus. And, to be completely fair to those 19th century scholars, they had a reason for this skepticism.
It wasn't just them being purely cynical.
Right. It wasn't just some anti-religious bias out of nowhere. It was an argument from silence.
The argument from silence. That sounds like a spy novel or something.
It does, but it's a classic logical fallacy. You see, up until the mid-1800s, there was almost zero physical evidence outside of the Bible to corroborate anything inside of it.
Nothing at all.
Almost nothing. If you went looking for the Hittites, or King David, or the pool where Jesus healed the blind man, you found nothing, just sand.
So if you can't see it, it didn't happen.
Exactly. The academic consensus became, if we can't find it, the Bible invented it.
Okay, so that is our antagonist for today's deep dive. This 19th century consensus that the Bible is just describing this fantasy world, a once-upon-a-time kind of world.
Yes.
But then, enter our protagonist.
The shovel.
The shovel. Just the most humble tool of manual labor.
It really is the great reversal in all of this. Over the last 150 years, the shovel has done more to dismantle that skepticism than perhaps any philosophical or theological argument ever could.
It's amazing.
We are talking about a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. Reports on over 25,000 biblical sites.
25,000?
Yeah. Detailed breakdowns of Old and New Testament artifacts and even testimonies from completely hostile secular historians.
And that brings us to our real mission for this deep dive. Because, look, we aren't just going to sit here and recite a laundry list of broken pottery.
Right. Nobody wants to listen to a list of shards.
No, that would be dry. And
Yeah.
we don't do dry here. We want to get to the heart of why all this matters to you. Because this isn't just about winning a historical debate, is it?
Not at all. It's about confidence.
Confidence.
Yeah. Our core thesis today is really this. Faith is not a leap into the dark. It is a step into a verified history.
Oh, I love that. A step into verified history.
Because when we can trust the earthly things the Bible speaks of, the geography, the politics, the customs, we have a deeply rational basis to trust the heavenly things it offers.
Right. It connects the physical to the spiritual. So let's just start digging. We have to start where the critics shouted the absolute loudest.
The very beginning.
The Old Testament. The world building and the patriarchs.
And specifically the issue of writing. This was the foundational critique of that 19th century era. Critics like Julius Wellhausen.
Oh, Wellhausen, the documentary hypothesis guy.
Exactly. He argued that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, could not possibly have been written by Moses, or anyone in the 2nd millennium BC for that matter.
And his reasoning was?
Simple. Writing just wasn't advanced enough.
So essentially, cavemen don't write Leviticus.
That's the very blunt version, yes. They genuinely believed that complex laws, detailed narratives, these intricate genealogies, they couldn't be recorded by semi-nomadic people in, say, 1400 BC.
Right.
They assumed oral tradition was the only method of transmission for centuries, which would mean the stories would have been hopelessly corrupted, like a giant game of telephone, long before they were ever put on parchment.
But then came what you called the mic drop.
Oh, the ultimate mic drop, the Ebla tablets.
Okay, tell us about Ebla, because I feel like this is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, but hardly anyone outside of archaeology departments has ever heard of it.
It's criminal how little it's talked about. So in the mid-1970s, at a site called Tel Mardik in Syria, excavators just hit the absolute jackpot.
And when we say jackpot, we aren't talking about like 3 or 4 broken pieces of a jar.
No, we're talking about an entire archive, a massive library. They found approximately 16,000 clay tablets.
16,000, and what's the dating on those?
They date back to around 2300 BC.
Okay, let me just do the math on that for a second. 2300 BC. That is centuries before Abraham even existed.
Yes.
That is nearly 1,000 years before Moses.
Exactly. And this discovery completely, utterly shattered the illiterate ancient theory. It proved that writing wasn't just existing in 2300 BC. It was highly widespread.
It was a bureaucratic society.
Extremely complex. These tablets weren't just simple grocery lists or tallies of sheep. They contained bilingual dictionaries.
Dictionaries.
Yes, administrative records, international treaties, literary texts.
So the capacity for really high-level, nuanced documentation was there a full millennium before Moses.
Without a doubt.
That completely pulls the rug out from under the idea that the Israelites were too primitive to write their own history.
It does, and it actually gets even more specific than just proving people could write.
I hope so.
Well, the critics used to say that the cities of the plain, mentioned in Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah, they said those were purely mythical cities, invented much later just to teach a moral lesson about sin.
Because there was no secular record of them.
Exactly. They argued that because we had no record of them outside the Bible, they simply didn't exist.
And let me guess, Ebla changed that.
The Ebla tablets actually list Sodom and Gomorrah as trade partners.
You're kidding.
Nope, there they are. Just mundane, everyday entries on a commercial shipping manifest from 2300 BC.
That is wild. A shipping manifest.
And they also found personal names in those archives that sound very, very familiar to anyone who reads the Bible. Names like Ishmael, Israel, Michael.
Now, we need to be super careful here for the audience. We aren't saying that the biblical Ishmael or the biblical Israel wrote these specific tablets, right?
Oh, no, not at all. The timeline wouldn't even match. But what it does prove is that those specific names were in common use in that specific geographical region at that exact time.
That validates the cultural context.
Perfectly. It proves that the world described in Genesis authentically fits the actual historical context of the 3rd millennium BC. It means that when the Bible says Moses wrote the law, historically speaking, that is an entirely plausible statement.
Man, that is a massive shift from calling it a pious forgery.
Huge shift.
But let's zoom in on the people a bit. You mentioned Abraham. He's the father of the faith, but for a really long time, he was treated as a man or myth question.
Very much so.
The critics said his life, his travels, his customs, none of it fit reality. They said the stories were completely anachronistic.
They did, and this is where 3 very specific archaeological sites come into crystal clear focus. We're talking about Mari, Nutsi, and Alak.
They sound like sci-fi planets, Nutsi and Alak.
They really do,
Yeah.
But they are ancient cities that have essentially given us the literal receipts for the culture of the book of Genesis.
Okay, let's break them down. Start with Mari. What exactly did we find there?
So Mari was this absolute powerhouse of a city on the Euphrates River. It was a major trade hub around 1800 BC, which puts it right in the chronological window of the patriarch.
Right in Abraham's era.
Exactly. And excavators found a massive palace there. We are talking a 6-acre complex.
6 acres.
Over 260 rooms, courtyards, winding passages, walls that were 15 feet high. And inside this palace, more archives. Over 20,000 cuneiform tablets.
Good grief. And what do those tablets tell us about the specific world Abraham lived in?
They paint an incredibly detailed picture of the geopolitical world he was moving through. The tablets describe the movements of these semi-nomadic groups, the established trade routes, the political alliances, and it perfectly mirrors the wanderings of the patriarchs as described in the Bible.
So it wasn't just a writer in Jerusalem 1,000 years later guessing what nomads did.
Not at all. It shows that the lifestyle described in Genesis wasn't an invention. It was an accurate, verifiable snapshot of the Middle Bronze Age.
That is so cool. But the Nutsi tablets, those are even more specific, right?
Oh.
Because this is where we get into the real nitty-gritty of the family drama in Genesis.
Oh, yeah.
And honestly, this is the part where the Bible gets pretty messy.
Nutsi is absolutely fascinating. These tablets date to about 1500 BC, and they explain the things in Genesis that, frankly, make modern readers really uncomfortable or confused.
You mean like the whole situation with Hagar and Ishmael?
Exactly that. Let's look at Genesis 16. Sarah is barren. Now, that is a personal tragedy in any era, but in the ancient world, it was an existential crisis for a family.
Right, no heir means no future.
Right. So she tells Abraham to sleep with her slave girl, Hagar, to produce an heir. Now, to modern ears, that just sounds like a bizarre, maybe even deeply immoral domestic crisis.
Yeah, it sounds like the whim of a really desperate couple making a terrible decision.
But the Nusi tablets reveal that this wasn't just a whim, it was actually the law.
Wait, it was the law.
Yes. Excavators found actual marriage contracts at Nusi that explicitly stipulate if a wife is barren, she must provide a slave girl to her husband to beget a son.
You're kidding. She was legally obligated to do it.
It was a binding legal obligation to ensure the family line continued. So Abraham and Sarah weren't just making up strange, dysfunctional rules on the fly. They were following the strict, standard legal procedure of their culture.
Wow. That completely changes how you read that story. It's no longer just Bible characters doing weird things. It's real people navigating the actual law of the land they lived in.
And it goes even further than that. Remember later in the story when Sarah eventually does have Isaac?
Right, the miracle baby in her old age.
Yes, yes. And once Isaac is born, Sarah gets jealous and wants to kick Hagar and Ishmael out of the camp entirely. And the Bible says Abraham is incredibly reluctant to do it. It says he was greatly distressed.
Right, and I think most of us always assumed that was just because, he loved his son Ishmael, which I'm sure he did.
Oh, that was certainly part of it, but the Nusi law codes add an intense layer of legal tension to that moment. Because the law stated that if the first wife eventually bore a son of her own, the slave girl's son could not be cast out.
Oh.
He had fiercely protected legal rights to the inheritance. So, legally speaking, Abraham actually couldn't kick them out. He was bound by the contract.
So when Sarah comes to him and says, get rid of them, she isn't just asking him to be harsh. She is asking him to literally break the law.
Exactly. She's demanding he breach contract. That's exactly why God had to step in and tell Abraham, listen to Sarah, I will take care of Ishmael. God was asking Abraham to step out in faith and go against the fundamental cultural law he lived by.
Man, that elevates the tension of the narrative so much. It goes from a petty domestic squabble to this massive legal and spiritual crisis.
It really does.
That is just fascinating context. And then you also mentioned Alak. What do we find there?
Alak adds a lot to the grit of the era. We find texts there describing really harsh social customs, including inheritance laws and even darker things, like specific laws regarding wife abuse.
Good.
Yeah, there are explicit descriptions of punishments like dragging by the nose.
Ouch. That is incredibly vivid and brutal.
It is brutal, but it highlights something important. The patriarchal age wasn't some sanitized Sunday school flannel graph story where everyone wore clean robes and smiled. It was a rough, violent, thoroughly pagan world.
And, that leads to a bit of an aha moment for me. When we look at this archaeological evidence, the strict legal contracts of Nusi, the vast trade routes of Mari, the brutality of Alak, it really doesn't paint Abraham as this stained-glass saint who just floated above reality.
Oh, right.
It paints him as a real man, deeply embedded in a specific, often very broken culture.
And that is exactly the spiritual connection we need to make here. Knowing Abraham's world is historically accurate reminds us that God works in real history. He called Abraham out of that specific culture, out of Ur, out of the binding laws of Nutsi and Mary to create something entirely new.
Yeah.
It validates that our faith is rooted in the gritty reality of human redemption. It's not a fairy tale where everyone is morally perfect from page 1.
I really love that. It makes the call of Abraham so much braver.
Yeah.
When he left, he was leaving behind the total legal security of his world.
Precisely. He was stepping into the unknown, trusting a God he was just getting to know.
Okay, let's move forward in time a bit. We are going to leave the tents of Abraham and move into the palaces of the kings. We're entering the monarchy era. We're talking gold, wars, and massive stone walls.
The era of Solomon. Now, this is another area where the critics historically had a total field day.
Oh, I bet.
The Bible claims Solomon had this massive unified army, thousands of chariots, gold flowing in from Ophir, and huge coordinated fortifications. And critics looked at the small, dusty ruins of Judea in the early 20th century and just laughed.
They thought it was all exaggerated.
It's a total exaggeration. It's a fable of a golden age that never actually happened. David and Solomon were likely just minor local chieftains of a small hill country village.
Right. Until Yigal-Yadin picked up a shovel at Megiddo.
Yes.
This is genuinely one of my favorite stories in the entire history of archaeology because it sounds like it was written for a Hollywood movie.
It really does. Yigal-Yadin was such a fascinating figure. He's a very famous Israeli archaeologist, but also a military general.
A real Renaissance man.
Yeah, a man of action and deep intellect. In the 1960s, he was excavating at Megiddo, which is an ancient fortress city, and he uncovered this massive city gate dating back to the Solomonic era, right around the 10th century BC.
And this gate had a very specific, unique design, right?
It did. It was what we call a six-chambered gate. Imagine walking through a long passage with 3 distinct guard rooms on your left and 3 on your right.
Okay.
It's a very distinct, heavy-duty military fortification designed to trap attackers.
And while he is standing there looking at this gate, he remembers a specific Bible verse.
1 Kings 9.15. It says, "Here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple and the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer."
Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So the Bible lists those 3 cities as a package deal, all built up by the exact same administration.
Exactly. So Yadin, being a military guy and an architect at heart, had a theory. He thought, if the Bible is historically accurate, and Solomon built all 3 of these using a central royal administration, shouldn't the architecture be completely standardized?
Like a franchise.
Right. So before he even started digging at the next site, Hazor, he actually sat down and drew a blueprint of the Megiddo Gate.
Wait, he drew the map before he dug the hole. That is incredibly bold.
It takes a lot of confidence. He went to Hazor and physically marked out on the bare ground where the walls and the chambers should be if the biblical text was right.
Imagine being the workers on that dig.
Yeah.
Boss, you're just guessing. You're drawing imaginary walls on top of dirt.
They probably thought he was losing his mind. But they started digging, removing tons of debris, and lo and behold, underneath all that dirt was the exact 6-chambered gate Yadin had drawn.
No way.
The measurements were almost completely identical. And then they went to Gezer, the 3rd city on the list, and found the exact same thing again.
That is the visual I just can't get out of my head. The exact same architect's signature across 3 different geographically separated cities, exactly where the Bible said they would be.
It conclusively confirms a centralized, powerful government capable of standardized military architecture across a region. You just do not get identical 6-chambered gates in 3 distant cities if you are just a local village chieftain.
Right, you need infrastructure.
You need a kingdom. You need a Solomon.
That's incredible. And what about the gold? Because you can't have the story of Solomon without the gold. The Bible speaks constantly of the gold of Ophir.
Ophir.
Yeah.
For a very long time, Ophir was considered a purely mythical place, like Atlantis or El Dorado.
A fairy tale land of riches.
Exactly. Critics said, we have absolutely no secular record of this place or this supposed massive trade network. But then a potsherd, literally just a piece of broken pottery, was found at Tel Kassil, which is near modern Tel Aviv. And it's essentially an ancient invoice.
An invoice, what does it say?
It reads, very simply, Ophir gold for Beth Horon, 30 shekels.
That's a literal receipt.
It is a receipt. It confirms that Ophir gold was a well-known commodity and a recognized trade standard in the region during that era. It completely anchors the economic reality of the biblical text.
So it wasn't a fairy tale of endless magical gold. It was a real functioning trade route with invoices, shipping manifests, and accountants.
Exactly. Real economics.
Okay, so we have the buildings, we have the gold. But what about the wars? Because, they say history is written by the victors. But in the case of the Bible, sometimes the historical verification actually comes from the losers, or at least the enemies.
The stones that speak Yahweh's name. This is one of the most powerful sections of biblical archaeology. We have to talk about the Moabite stone, which is also known as the Mesha still.
Now, this one has quite the dramatic backstory just regarding how it was found, right? Something about it being roasted in a fire.
It's an archaeological tragedy that barely turned into a triumph. In 1868, a missionary found this beautiful black basalt stone in Jordan. It was about 3 feet tall, and it was completely covered in ancient writing.
Okay.
But the local Bedouins saw that the Europeans were extremely interested in it, and they became highly suspicious. They thought, well, maybe there's gold hidden inside the stone. Or perhaps they realized they could make more money if they broke it and sold the pieces individually to multiple different buyers.
Oh, no. So what did they do?
They built a massive roaring fire around the stone, they got the basalt red hot, and then they poured freezing cold water all over it.
The thermal shock. It must have exploded.
It shattered into dozens and dozens of pieces. It was an absolute disaster for history. But fortunately, a papier-mâché impression, what archaeologists call a squeeze, had been taken by a researcher just before it was destroyed.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, so scholars were eventually able to track down and buy up most of the fragments and piece it back together using that impression as a guide. You can actually go see it today. It is currently housed in the Louvre in Paris.
That's amazing. And when they finally translated it, what did this rescued stone actually say?
It was written by King Mesha of Moab, and he's basically bragging about rebelling against Israel. It dates to right around 840 BC. He writes, "I am Mesha, king of Moab. As for Omri, king of Israel, he humbled Moab many years."
Wait, he names the biblical King Omri?
He absolutely does. He also mentions the house of David as his enemy. But most remarkably of all, he mentions that he took the vessels of Yahweh and dragged them before his own god Chemosh.
Hold on, he actually used the name Yahweh.
Yes. This is the earliest known reference to the God of Israel found anywhere outside the Bible.
Wow.
And think about the context here. This is a hostile witness. Mesha hates Israel. He isn't writing this to try and prove the Hebrew Bible is true. He's trying to brag about beating them in battle.
Great, it's propaganda.
But in the process of his propaganda, he accidentally confirms the political events of 2 Kings chapter 3. He confirms the historical lineage of David. And he confirms that the nation of Israel worshipped a god named Yahweh.
It's amazing how history works like that.
Yeah.
Mesha just wanted to glorify himself, but thousands of years later, he ended up verifying the Bible for us.
Absolutely. And we see that exact same dynamic again with the Black Obelisk.
What's that one?
This is a large black limestone pillar from Assyria, discovered in 1846. It shows the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III receiving tribute from various conquered kingdoms. On one of the carved panels, you see a figure bowing down face, practically in the dirt, kissing the ground in front of the emperor.
Okay.
And the caption underneath reads, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri."
Are you saying we have an actual picture of an Israelite king?
We do. It's the only contemporary physical depiction of an Israelite king we have ever found. We are looking at the face, or at least the carved profile, of King Jehu from 841 BC.
That gives me chills.
It completely confirms the interaction between Israel and Assyria exactly as the historical books of the Bible describe it.
And then there's Hezekiah's tunnel. I've actually had the chance to walk through this one in Jerusalem. It's terrifyingly claustrophobic, but just incredible.
It is an absolute engineering marvel for its time. So the context here is that the Assyrian army is coming to lay siege to Jerusalem. King Hezekiah knows they will die of thirst if they don't secure the water supply. So 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles 32 describe how he diverted the water from the Gihon spring outside the city, bringing it inside the walls.
Right.
He ordered a tunnel to be dug through 750 feet of solid bedrock.
And for a really long time, people wondered, did they really dig this? Because digging from both ends and somehow meeting perfectly in the middle in pitch blackness without GPS or modern surveying tools, it seems physically impossible.
It does seem impossible. But in 1880, a young boy was wading in the pool at the very end of the tunnel, and he felt something carved into the rock wall. It was an ancient inscription. We call it the Siloam inscription.
Now, what did it say?
It was essentially a commemorative plaque written by the workers themselves. It describes the dramatic final moments when the 2 teams of diggers, who had started from completely opposite ends, finally met in the middle. It says, "While there were yet 3 cubits to be broken through, the voice of each was heard calling to his fellow. The tunnelers struck each man towards his fellow, axe against axe."
Axe against axe. Man, you can almost hear the sound of the metal hitting the rock in the dark.
It's so visceral, and Again, it deeply grounds the story. It's not a spiritual legend. It's a grueling construction project. We know the gradient of that tunnel. It's incredibly slight, less than a 1% grade over a third of a mile. The engineering skill of ancient Jerusalem was elite.
Okay, let's move to a time when things went really wrong for Israel, the exile. The Babylonians come in, they destroy the temple, the people are taken captive to Babylon. Now, this is where the Bible gets very specific about foreign kings. And for a long time, this is where the critics shouted the loudest about historical errors.
Ah, yes. The case of the missing king. This is one of the most famous contradictions that archaeology completely solved.
We're talking about Belshazzar, right?
Yep.
From the famous writing on the wall story in the book of Daniel, chapter 5.
Right. So Daniel 5 presents this man, Belshazzar, as the last king of Babylon. He's the one throwing the massive party, drinking from the stolen temple vessels, when the ghostly hand appears and writes on the wall.
Right.
The problem was, for centuries, every single ancient historian we had access to, guys like Herodotus or Berossus, they all listed a guy named Nabonidus as the absolute last king of Babylon. They didn't mention a Belshazzar at all. Zero record of him.
So the critics said Daniel was just a straight-up fraud.
They did. They said the author of Daniel clearly lived hundreds of years later, didn't know his basic history, and just made up a king to serve his story.
And for centuries, this was considered a total slam dunk for the skeptics, wasn't it?
It was the go-to example of biblical error. It was definitive proof that Daniel was historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But then, in the mid-19th century, archaeologists were excavating the Great Ziggurat at Ur, and they found a small clay cylinder. The Nabonidus cylinder.
And what did it reveal? Let me guess. Belshazzar.
It revealed that Nabonidus was indeed the king, but he was a very eccentric guy. He kind of fell out of favor with the powerful priesthood in Babylon, so he decided to just leave. He went to live in the desert oasis of Taima in Arabia for 10 years to worship the moon god.
You just went on a 10-year sabbatical.
He physically left the capital. And who did he leave in charge to run the empire while he was gone?
Belshazzar.
The inscription specifically includes a prayer for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring. And later, another text called the Nabonidus Chronicle confirmed that while the father was away in Arabia, the prince was in Babylon commanding the army and running the government.
So Belshazzar was the regent. He was the king in all but the official title.
Exactly. He was the de facto ruler of the empire. And this explains a tiny, obscure detail in Daniel 5 that literally no one understood for millennia.
Oh, I love this part.
It's a detail that basically proves the author had to be there. Remember what Belshazzar offers Daniel if he can interpret the writing on the wall?
He offers to make him the third ruler in the kingdom.
Right. Why the third? Why not the second? Think about it. If Belshazzar was the top dog, the absolute monarch, he would offer the number 2 spot, just like Pharaoh did for Joseph in Egypt.
Oh, because Belshazzar himself was only number 2.
Bingo! Nabonidus was number 1. Belshazzar was number 2. The highest possible spot available to offer Daniel was number 3.
That is absolutely brilliant.
It shows that the writer of Daniel had this intimate, accurate knowledge of Babylonian politics that had been completely lost to secular history for centuries. Herodotus didn't even know about Belshazzar, but Daniel did.
The Bible was right when the historians were wrong.
Exactly.
Man, that is a quote for the fridge right there.
And we see it continue right into the return from exile with the Cyrus cylinder.
This is the famous clay barrel that looks kind of like a corn cob, right?
Yes, that's the one. It records the official policy of Cyrus the Great of Persia after he conquered Babylon. Now, the Assyrians and Babylonians had a very brutal policy of deportation, moving conquered people away from their homelands to break their spirits.
Right, which is how the Jews ended up in Babylon in the first place.
But Cyrus boasts on this cylinder that he implemented a completely reverse policy. He allowed captive peoples to return to their homelands and even gave them funds to rebuild their sanctuaries.
Which matches the book of Ezra perfectly. Ezra chapter 1 says, "The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus to let them go build the temple."
It deeply validates the prophetic fulfillment. God moves the hearts of secular kings, kings who don't even worship him, to accomplish his will and bring his people home.
Okay, so we've covered the Old Testament pretty thoroughly. The shovel has been very, very kind to the Hebrew Scriptures. But now we really need to turn the page. Let's talk about the New Testament.
The New Testament archaeology is definitely a different beast. We aren't digging up massive mounds of destroyed cities quite as much. It's more about finding manuscripts, specific coins, and detailed inscriptions.
Right.
It's about precision. because the New Testament claims to be set squarely in real documented Roman history, so it should perfectly match the Roman records.
Gritty reality and Roman bureaucracy. Let's start with the timeline, because critics often said the New Testament writers, especially Luke, were just kind of telling theological stories without real historical anchoring.
Which is incredibly ironic because Luke is actually a first-rate historian. Sir William Ramsay, who was a famous archaeologist and actually started out as a major skeptic of the Bible, he eventually concluded that Luke was one of the greatest historians of antiquity purely because of his extreme accuracy.
Wow.
Let's look at the Gallio inscription as an example.
Who is Gallio?
He's mentioned in Acts chapter 18. He's the Roman proconsul of Achaia, that's the region around Corinth, who actually dismissed the legal charges against the Apostle Paul. Now, for a long time, we didn't know exactly when this happened in history.
Okay.
But at Delphi, they found a fragmentary stone letter from Emperor Claudius. And it explicitly mentions Gallio by his name and his specific title.
And since it's an official letter from the emperor, it has a date on it.
Extremely precisely dated. Based on Claudius's regnal years mentioned in the text, we can determine that Gallio's term as proconsul was specifically from the summer of AD 51 to the summer of AD 52.
That is a very tight window.
And because the book of Acts tells us Paul was there when Gallio was there, we can confidently date Paul's ministry in Corinth to that exact 12-month window. It permanently anchors the Acts of the Apostles, a fixed point in secular world history.
It turns sometime in the hazy past into AD 51.
Yeah.
It completely locks it into the timeline.
Exactly. And then there's the Lysanias problem.
The Lysanias problem? What's that?
So Luke 3.1 is an absolute nightmare for anyone trying to fake history because Luke gives this massive 6-point dateline to open the chapter. He lists emperors, regional governors, and local tetrarchs just to set the historical stage for John the Baptist.
Right, he's showing his work.
Yeah, and he mentions Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene.
And I'm assuming the critics pounced on that one.
They absolutely did. They said, the only Lysanias we know from history was a regional king who was executed by Mark Antony in 36 BC. That is 50 years before John the Baptist. Luke completely got his facts wrong.
Classic Luke doesn't know what he's talking about argument.
Until an inscription was found at a site called Abila near Damascus. It formally dedicates a temple to Lysanias the Tetrarch, and the dating of that inscription
Let me guess.
between AD 14 and 29.
Right in the exact window of John the Baptist and Jesus.
Luke was right all along. There were simply two different rulers named Lysanias. The critics had assumed Luke was wrong based purely on their own incomplete information.
And then there's Erastus. I really like this one because it's just so incredibly mundane.
Romans 16.23. Paul is writing his letter from Corinth, and he sends greetings to Rome from Erastus, the city treasurer. Now, in 1929, archaeologists were excavating a paved public square near the theater in Corinth, and they found a Latin inscription embedded in the stone.
And it said?
It said, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense.
And an aedile is like a city official or a treasurer.
Yes, exactly. It matches Paul's description perfectly, and here's the real insight. Luke and Paul aren't writing fables. They are casually dropping the names of real politicians, real local officials, real timelines.
Yeah.
If they are this incredibly accurate about the minor, mundane details of who paid for the sidewalk in Corinth, we have very good reason to trust them on the major details.
And that naturally brings us to the biggest subject of all. Jesus. We're talking about Jesus and the dirt and stone. Because for a long time, critics basically said, well, Jesus is just a spiritual idea. The Gospels are just elaborate metaphors.
But the archaeology constantly insists on his physicality. Take the Pilate stone, for instance. It was discovered at Caesarea Maritima, which was the Roman administrative headquarters in Judea on the coast. It's a large limestone block with a dedication to Emperor Tiberius.
And it actually has Pilate's name on it.
It clearly reads Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
Wow.
Before this discovery in 1961, we had absolutely no physical evidence of Pilate outside of the Bible and the historian Josephus. Some more radical critics even questioned if he was a real governor or just a literary device invented to blame the Romans.
But the stone proves he was real.
It proves he was exactly who the Gospels say he was, the official Roman authority with the absolute power of life and death in Judea.
And speaking of life and death, we have to talk about the Pool of Siloam. This is a very recent one, right? Like 2004.
Very recent. In John chapter 9, Jesus heals a man born blind and tells him, go, wash in the Pool of Siloam. For centuries, we thought the Pool of Siloam was just this tiny little church pool at the very end of Hezekiah's tunnel that we mentioned earlier.
But then a municipal sewage crew was digging.
It is always the sewage crews. In Jerusalem, you literally can't fix a broken pipe without finding a lost civilization. They hit some ancient stone steps. They started excavating and uncovered a massive pool. We're talking the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools.
That is massive.
It was a massive ritual bath, a mikveh, for thousands of pilgrims coming to the temple to purify themselves.
It's huge.
It's real. It's a very physical place. You can travel there today and literally sit on the stone steps where the blind man might have stumbled down with mud on his eyes. It completely moves the story from symbolic fable to historical event.
And then we get to perhaps the most somber discovery, the historical physical reality of crucifixion. We have the ossuary of a man named Yohanan ben Agalgal.
This is a hard one to talk about, but it's incredibly necessary. Critics used to argue that the story of Jesus' burial was fake because Romans usually just threw crucifixion victims into common trenches or left them on the cross for animals to eat.
To maximize the humiliation.
Right. They also constantly debated the actual mechanics of it. Did the nails go through the hands, the wrists, the feet? Were they just tied with ropes?
So what exactly did they find with Yohanan?
In a burial cave just north of Jerusalem, they found an ossuary, which is a limestone bone block used for secondary burials. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man named Yohanan. And driven straight through his right heel bone was a large, heavy iron nail, about 11.5 centimeters long.
Oh, man. And there was actually wood attached to it.
Yes. Fragments of olive wood were still preserved on the tip of the nail. What likely happened is the nail had hit a hard knot in the vertical wood of the cross and bent sharply, hooking into the wood so deeply that they couldn't pull it out when they took his body down.
So they had to take part of the cross with him.
They had to bury him with the nail still wedged in his bone.
That is just gruesome.
It is deeply gruesome. But archaeologically, it proves 2 massive points. 1, crucifixion victims were sometimes given proper Jewish burials in family tombs, just exactly like Jesus was given by Joseph of Arimathea. This completely refutes the idea that he absolutely had to be thrown in a pit.
Right.
And 2, it confirms the brutal physical mechanics. The nails were real, the suffering was real. It entirely dispels the modern, sanitized idea that the crucifixion was just a symbolic story about suffering.
It grounds the cross in actual history. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real wood, real iron, and real bone.
Precisely.
Now let's pivot a bit to the witnesses who didn't actually want to be witnesses at all. We call this section the hostile witnesses.
This is a crucial section for anyone who ever asks, if I lost my Bible, could I still legally or historically prove Jesus existed?
So if every Bible in the world just vanished today, poof, gone, what will we have left to construct the story of Jesus?
We would have the direct testimony of the people who absolutely hated the movement.
Okay, let's start with Flavius Josephus.
He was a very prominent Jewish historian, writing right around AD 93. He worked directly for the Roman emperors. He was absolutely not a Christian.
But he mentions Jesus in his writings.
He does. In his massive work, Antiquities of the Jews, there's a very famous passage called the Testimonium Flavianum. Now, some scholars do think later Christian scribes might have added a few glowing phrases to it over the centuries, but the core historical data is generally accepted by almost everyone.
What does the core say?
He explicitly calls Jesus a wise man and a doer of marvelous deeds. He mentions that Pilate condemned him to the cross. He even mentions James later on calling him the brother of Jesus who was called Christ.
So we have a non-Christian Jewish historian working for Rome confirming that Jesus lived, did miracles or marvelous deeds, and was crucified by Pilate.
Yes. Then you have Tacitus. He's arguably the greatest Roman historian of the era, writing around AD 115. He thoroughly hated Christians. He actually called the religion a mischievous superstition. He described how Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. But in his annals, Tacitus explicitly states that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Wow. He's verifying the official death certificate, essentially.
It's exactly that. He confirms the founder, the method of execution, the ruling official, and the exact time frame.
Incredible.
Then there's Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor in what is now Turkey. He writes a very formal letter to Emperor Trajan around AD 110 asking for legal advice on what to do with these Christians in his province.
And what does he say about them?
He describes their early worship services. He says they meet before dawn on a fixed day to sing hymns to Christ as to a god.
So within roughly a lifetime of Jesus dying, his followers are already worshiping him fully as God. It wasn't some myth or legend that slowly developed over 3 centuries.
Not at all. And finally, we have the Jewish Talmud, the ancient rabbinic writings. They directly accuse Jesus of sorcery.
Sorcery. Why sorcery?
Think carefully about that specific accusation. They aren't saying he didn't do anything. They aren't saying he was a total fake who tricked people. They're saying he did actual supernatural things, but he did them by the devil's power.
Right.
It is an indirect, hostile admission that Jesus was, in fact, a miracle worker. They literally couldn't deny the power he displayed, so they had to attack the source of the power.
So if we synthesize all this together, Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, the Talmud, what do we get?
We get the absolute core facts of the gospel, even completely without the New Testament documents. Secular Roman and Jewish history tells us. Jesus lived, he was a teacher, he did unexplainable feats, he was executed by Pilate, and his followers worshipped him as God immediately.
That is just a rock-solid foundation.
It means you don't have to check your brain at the door to be a Christian.
And that actually brings us to the final leg of our journey today. We've looked at the stones, the tablets, the bones, the Roman books, but this is the deep dive, so we have to ask the big so what. What does this all actually mean for you? How do we move from just historical verification to actual veneration?
This is where the head finally meets the heart. I really like to use what I call the earthen vessel analogy.
Break that down for us.
The Bible isn't some magical book floating in the ether, disconnected from reality. It isn't set in Narnia or Middle-earth. It is deeply rooted in actual dirt, Roman coins, flawed kings, and iron nails. When we see that the history is real, it forces us to confront the reality of the God who actually entered that history.
Let's go back to the Pool of Siloam as an example of that.
Okay, perfect. Imagine you're reading John chapter 9. You read about the blind man washing his eyes in the pool. If you think that pool is just a neat literary symbol, then the blind man is likely just a symbol too.
Right.
And if the blind man is just a symbol, then the healing is just a nice metaphor for enlightenment. And if the healing is a metaphor,
Then the healer is just a metaphor.
exactly, it becomes just a nice moral story about gaining spiritual insight. But if the pool is real, and we know it is, you can go touch the stones today, then the blind man was likely a real man with real gritty mud on his eyes.
Yeah.
And if he was real, then the Jesus who stood before him, who touched his face, was incredibly real. It forces you to deal with Jesus not as a good teacher in a fictional storybook, but as a physical, undeniable force in history.
It really empowers us to live for him because it gives us absolute confidence in the truth.
Yes. But we live in a highly skeptical world. We constantly hear the Bible is full of errors or science and history have disproved religion. But when you actually look at the track record of the shovel, it tells a radically different story.
It really does.
Archaeology has, in so many cases, completely refuted the views of modern critics. It has shown over and over that those skeptical views rested on false assumptions, like the arrogant assumption that Moses couldn't write or that Belshazzar didn't exist.
So knowing all this gives the believer a real backbone. You don't ever have to be afraid of history or science because the more we dig, the more the Bible is vindicated.
And it deeply emphasizes the incarnation. I think that's honestly the most beautiful part for me, personally.
How so? Connect that for us.
Archaeology proves the reality of the incarnation. It proves God didn't just send a spiritual memo from heaven. He came down. He ate food that literally grew in the soil of Galilee. He paid his taxes with real silver shekels minted in Tyre.
Wow.
He suffered under specific Roman laws that we can read today on bronze tablets. He died on a cross made of real olive wood. God entered our reality, the harsh reality of dirt and stone, to save us.
There's one last discovery I want to mention today because it intimately connects us to the very early believers. The Megiddo Church.
Ah, yes. This is a beautiful one. This was found, somewhat ironically, near the modern Megiddo maximum security prison in Israel. They found the physical remains of a Christian church prayer hall from the 3rd century.
The 3rd century. That is incredibly early.
It is before Constantine, before Christianity was even a legal religion in the Roman Empire.
And they found a mosaic floor there, right?
A stunningly beautiful floor mosaic, and right in the center, there is an inscription that reads, "The God-loving Achaetus has offered this table to the God Jesus Christ."
To the God Jesus Christ.
That is profound. Modern critics love to say that Jesus was just a good man, and the church totally invented his divinity and turned him into a god centuries later at the Council of Nicaea.
Right, the whole Da Vinci Code theory.
Exactly. But here, deeply buried in the dirt of the 3rd century, long before any councils, we find regular, everyday believers explicitly worshiping Jesus as God.
We stand in a very long line of faith.
A long, historically verified line.
So here's the big takeaway for you, our listener. When you open your Bible tomorrow morning,
Don't read it as a collection of moral fables. Don't read it like Aesop's fables.
read it as a firm record of reality.
Read it knowing that the very stones have cried out to defend it.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. We've covered a lot of solved historical mysteries today. Belshazzar, the Hittites, the Pool of Siloam. But there are certainly still things in the Bible that puzzle historians today. There are still apparent conflicts we haven't figured out yet.
That's true.
But if the history of archaeology has taught us anything over the last 2 centuries, it's this. The problem usually isn't the text. It's that we just haven't dug deep enough yet.
The shovel is still working.
And the truth is waiting. Thanks for diving in with us today. Keep digging, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.